In this episode of Run It Back, we continue reading Professor Richard Wolff's Understanding Socialism and explore the history of and modern context of why socialism is taboo in America. The real title of this chapter is actually A Brief History, How Socialism Got to Its Here and Now. And while this chapter definitely contains a brief history, it's mostly about the context that led to how we think about socialism today. So in the late 1700s, the American Revolution and the French Revolution succeed. And suddenly we've ushered in a new era of democracy and capitalism and making your own money and voting and things like that. And it's pretty cool, right? Not really, because immediately those people started to see the hallmark problem of capitalism that we still face today, and that is massive income inequality and wealth disparity, and this pissed people off. So right away, we start getting critiques of capitalism, and this was the basis of socialism. In this time, they also pretty much solidified the hallmark of socialism, the trademark that we still think of today, and that is equality. They right away saw that it was unfair for so few to have so much and for so many to have so little. So that income inequality was already a driving factor in trying to fix capitalism. In the early 19th century, that's the early 1800s, socialism started to take root as an idea in Europe. And this was pretty much a mix of remnants of that revolutionary thinking of the American and French revolutions, mixed with people just being pissed off because everything they had fought for, all that freedom, seemed to have been kind of bullshit because it was still just rich people being rich and poor people staying poor. In the second half of the 19th century, that is the 1850s onwards, European socialists kind of gained some strength and started gaining ground. They were strong enough to form unions. They had their own political parties and movements. They were printing their own newspapers and pamphlets and doing kind of whatever they could to spread the word about socialism and just to educate people that, hey, there are options here. We could be fighting for something else. Right around that same time, socialist literature first started to develop. This was highlighted early on by Karl Marx and Engels when they published the Communist Manifesto in 1848, and this kind of culminated in 1894 after Marx had passed when Engels published Capital, which was based on a series of notes he had found from Marx, and it was super important to the socialist movement because it defined exploitation as a fundamental injustice. And it's still something we talk about today, exploiting people. But his definition was pretty harsh. To him, exploitation was whenever an employee was producing more value for his employer than the value of the wages being paid to him or her. That means essentially that all the profit that is produced by employees shouldn't just go to the boss. It should be distributed among the employees themselves, the people who produce the profit. That was then and still is now pretty controversial, but it makes sense, right? The people actually making the stuff should have the benefits of what that stuff brings back. But opponents to that would suggest that maybe the people who invest the money early on should get the most benefit back. But I would say, who has the opportunity to invest? People who already have money. To Marx, there was a way to end exploitation. And this goes back to the intro when we talk about the slave-master dynamic, the subject-king, the lord and serf. Ending exploitation was about, quote, replacing the employer-employee relationship with an alternative production organization in which employees function democratically as their own employers. That's from Wolff, not Marx. What that means is that a more fair system would be where people are their own bosses. And I don't think that just means like manager. That doesn't actually make sense. You still want managers. You still want people who know what they're doing and understand systems and processes. It just means that the employees also share equal roles as the owners of the companies. They're the ones determining how to invest, what to invest in, what to produce, when to produce it, and where the profits go ultimately. Now, remember, like we learned in the intro, there is no one school of thought, and pretty much right away, different schools of thought emerged around socialism. There were two big fights early on, and they're the same fights we're having right now. The first was how to achieve socialism, and the second was how to implement socialism. Now, there are two strategies for each. The two different strategies for how to achieve socialism are the utopian socialists and the scientific socialists. I think that's better understood as the modelers and the mixers, is how I think of them. The modelers, the utopians, believe that people need to see and experience socialist structures right now in order to support them later. This is basically modeling socialism. And it made me think of like studying abroad or something like that. I had a friend in Paris for a summer or a semester or something, broke her ankle, and she was fine. She went to the hospital, never got a bill or anything like that. She came back here and was all about Medicare for all or universal health care because it had been modeled for her. She had experienced it. She had seen how great it was, and suddenly, oh, we need that here. It was obvious to her. So I totally understand the power of modeling and utopian. The second strategy for how to achieve socialism, and this is scientific socialism, or as I was calling it, the mixer. And this basically says that we need just the right ingredients when they're mixed together will mobilize a revolutionary working class within capitalism. So it's the right people with the right problem, with the right resources at the right time, and then socialists need to be ready to seize that moment and exploit it, I guess you could, but turn it into a revolution, essentially. And so those are the two different kinds, and they essentially lean to evolution and revolution, which we will get to in the next, which is the next section, which is the two different tactics for how to implement socialism. So you can achieve it by modeling it out and making people believe, and then those people will go and vote for it and fight for it. Or you could have some big inciting moment and have just the right combination of everything you need, and we can launch into socialism. And that could happen at a large scale like a government, or also your workplace. There could be some major incident where suddenly the employees get together and say, hey, we're buying you out, we own this now, we're taking control, or whatever happens. So that's interesting. But the two tactics are essentially evolutionary socialism and revolutionary socialism. So evolutionary or reform or parliamentary socialism, it basically suggests that we need to reform capitalism from within. That means running candidates in elections, creating electoral coalitions. That means working with people that you don't 100% agree with, like working with Democrats or working with the Green Party or whatever it is. And then pushing for specific reforms while also standing for and pushing for greater transformational change. So this is pretty much like how we're doing things now. This is essentially what Bernie Sanders was doing, even though he was calling for a revolution. His tactic was a lot more reform-oriented. Now, the other one is the revolution tactic to implement socialism, and this was Vladimir Lenin's thing, which we'll get back to him. And this believes essentially that capitalists will never relinquish their wealth or power without resorting to extreme measures, including mass violence. This basically suggests, and I don't know if it's right or wrong, that there's no chance socialism can take hold so long as there are capitalists with power. And just simply trying to vote them out or replace them won't work, because as they start losing state power, they would resort to violence. Now, I don't know that that would actually happen in the United States, but we did see when Bernie Sanders was getting some power in 2016 what the party did to crush him and what the media did to crush him. Obviously, that's not violence unless you have some specific academic definition of violence, then maybe whatever. But nobody got hurt, right? Besides here, right here. So it's interesting. It's interesting. With the revolutionary tactic for implementing socialism, you're always looking to identify moments when revolutionary ruptures were possible within capitalism, similar to the scientific socialism for the strategy, where you're trying to find the exact right mix of the event that's happening, the people involved, the workplace, the context. Everything just has to be just right. But there is a third method as well, which is to take a middle ground approach, which I'm sure everyone watching this loves middle ground approaches. And this is about working inside and outside of the system, but promoting a revolutionary break. And to me, this just won't work, because anything you do outside of a system will undermine any of your work inside the system. Even if it doesn't, the other players working against you will make it so it does. So now that we understand the context of that early stages of socialism, what brought it about, what people were thinking at the time, and what the big debates were at the time within socialism, we can get into the actual history of when it really started, which is 1917 with the Soviet Revolution, Red October, which resulted in the first lasting government that was committed to socialism, or is what they called socialism. Vladimir Lenin, who I mentioned earlier, he was the first leader of the Soviet Union, which wasn't the Soviet Union yet, it was Russia. He was a Russian lawyer, he was a revolutionary, he was the leader of the Bolshevik Party and of that October Revolution. He was the first leader of the USSR and the government that took over Russia in 1917. Just for some back history, the Bolshevik Revolution went from 1917 until 1923. In that time, they deposed of the monarchy. They completely abolished the monarchy there. And at the end of 1923, they established the Soviet Union at the end of the Russian Civil War. But USSR wasn't really socialist in the way me and you are probably thinking about socialism today. This is really the beginning of when socialism gets real taboo in the United States, especially the beginning of that thought vein. And that's because suddenly the world had to deal with two forms of socialism. We had to deal with the form of socialism that people were pushing for in their own countries in the United States, which is what we'll be talking about, and you had to deal with the socialism that existed in Russia, the USSR. So suddenly anything the USSR did, you had to fight back against or say wasn't real socialism, or you just had to deal with as a socialist back then. So it immediately complicated things. The debate was pretty much, did the USSR embody, distort, or betray socialism? And that debate continues at a core of the taboo today. People who are anti-socialist would say, well, Russia already embodied that. They already did that. How'd that turn out? Or they might say, it's not possible. Or they might say, well, a dictator takes over, or it requires a dictator, or whatever it is. Everything that Russia did is now associated with socialism, which makes it really, really hard to get past that when talking to people about the benefits of a socialist system. Now, with the beginning of the USSR, socialism essentially split into two factions, I guess. Not really factions, but labels. The first, socialists, were people who were critical of the Soviet implementation, and they held on to that socialist title, at least for now. The other group were communists, and they took on the name communist, and they essentially just supported the Soviet interpretation. So early on, communist just meant Soviet socialist, and socialist meant socialists who didn't like how they did socialism. So that's kind of confusing, but whatever. Now remember that Lenin guy that I keep bringing up? He turns out he was pretty smart, but he said that what the Soviets had accomplished was not socialism, and that was a big deal. He labeled it state capitalism, and by that he meant socialists had achieved and sustained state power and had used it to displace private capitalists from their enterprise positions. So essentially, they had created a government, taken government representatives, and just put them into the positions of power at these big companies. and they called it socialism because the people voted for the government who chose the representative who then was put into the company, and so therefore that person represented the people who were over here. And because they didn't, that employee-employer dynamic that socialism was fundamentally trying to address was never addressed. You still had the exact same power dynamic within Soviet socialism or communism. And that wasn't any good. Now, when Lenin labeled the Soviet Union state capitalism, that was really interesting, and it led to a couple years of interesting times. State capitalism became an alternative to capitalism and as a thing that could coexist side by side with both capitalism and socialism, because not everything had to be owned or ran by the state. You could have some things with state control. You could have other businesses that were completely socialist, where there was no state intervention, but also there was no owner class. And then you could have private businesses as well. Could they all exist at the same time? Maybe. Are certain things better for ones and certain things better for others? Probably. I don't know. We will see. But for a brief time, there was a broadening of understanding of socialism and the nuances around it, and it was a good time. And then Lenin died. In 1924, shit got fucked. So when Lenin dies, you got the two big guys in Russia, Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin. So they're fighting for control. Stalin wins, and he's kind of a dick. He changes socialist debates in a big way, and that's because he declared that they had achieved socialism, which they hadn't. They were state capitalist, as Lenin had said, but Stalin said, no, fuck that, we have achieved socialism. And this fucked America in terms of their understanding and thinking about socialism. Suddenly, everything Russia did was a direct representation of socialism. It wasn't like before where you could say, well, they're not really socialism, they're state capitalist, or, whatever. No. Now, everything they did was socialism, because if you asked them, hey, are you socialist? They'd say, yes, no, we are socialist. But again, they kind of weren't, and it was really bad for socialists not in that communist vein, because they were a dictatorship. Their people were really poor, and they had horrible internal conflicts all the time. So it was a shitty representation of socialism. Now, it still technically was socialism, because it was a critique of capitalism and a new system that tried to rearrange how the power dynamics and address the employer-employee dynamic. It didn't do it well, but it tried to do that. Now, there was a second big change to socialism that was happening around this time too. Around then, the USSR started supporting local movements against capitalist imperialism. So all these capitalist countries, the United States included, United Kingdom, were going to other countries, were stealing their resources, were having wars, were doing whatever they could, implementing their own economy. Now, the United States was supporting a lot of this colonialism, and essentially the United States fucked themselves by doing that. Now, let me try to play this out for you. By trying to stop communism, we acted ourselves as a virus that spread socialism, because, as we know, socialism is a response to capitalism. And so by bringing in hyper-capitalism to all these different countries, they immediately saw the worst parts of it. So instead of having to live through generations or a time period and figure out, well, capitalism isn't great, we need to develop a critique of it, we need to implement a new system, they skipped all that and they ran straight to, oh, fuck this, let's do socialism or communism, because Russia was the representative of socialism at the time. So what we did and what Russia did by defending these local movements from capitalist imperialism was put socialism in a fast lane. They no longer had to go through generations of capitalism. They could go straight to socialism. In the meantime, as colonialism, capitalism, was ravaging all these countries, and all these people were getting pissed off and learning about socialism, which was the way they could combat capitalism, we really, or they really enriched the philosophy behind socialism, the literature behind socialism, and the ideas and conversations. So, the USA, by trying so hard to stop communism, what we really did was plant seeds for it all over the place. So then, United States and Russia put aside our differences for a little bit, and we killed Hitler. That's pretty cool, right? I think we can all be happy that we killed Hitler. And then after World War II, socialist parties started forming. They were forming governments by themselves or in coalitions all across Europe, and sometimes they were forming them with communists who supported Russia. So you had this weird dynamic where you had more Western socialists working with the Russian communists, and they used to be enemies, but now they're just trying to get something done after this horrible war had destroyed most of Europe. But it wasn't easy, like everything else with developing socialism. The anti-socialist, anti-communist sentiments were strong, which meant that socialism was not taught in schools, and when it was essentially just dismissed. It was seen as the failed thing. Hey, here's the thing that sucks. Here's the thing Hitler was. Here's the thing the Russians are. Check them out. They suck. And it was just generally demonized all across the country and all across society in general. In the 1950s, teachers with known socialist sympathies were just being fired everywhere. Unions also began turning their backs on what were their most militant members, their best fighters, the people they relied on the most. They just started turning their backs on them because people said socialism was bad. And so if you were associated with a socialist, then maybe you were a socialist, and maybe you were bad too. People were incredibly weak back then, or maybe the peer pressure was incredibly strong, but I don't know. That we had just killed Hitler, so it was crazy, I bet. And what you saw is that in the United States, as the unions pushed away their best members, we've seen a 50-year decline in labor. And part of that is because they weakened themselves on purpose. So now it's the 1970s. The USSR has recovered completely from World War II and is now the second world superpower. And they're not alone in their communist ways. Communist parties have power in Eastern Europe, China, Cuba, Vietnam, and plenty of other places. The US retreated from Vietnam in 1975. By retreated, I mean we pretty much lost. I mean, it sucked. It was a horrible war. We should have never been there in the first place. We were getting our asses kicked, and so we left in 1975. Luckily, we did leave, but this was seen as a major victory for socialism, maybe the peak for modern socialism, as Richard Wolff calls it. Meanwhile, socialism continued to be divided, and the socialism-communism split was just further hardened by the Cold War. The people who used to call themselves socialists were now kind of going by democratic socialist, which is the same thing Bernie Sanders was going by in 2016 and 2020. That democratic socialism grew and began to take hold in Northern and Western Europe. However, workplaces were still left in the hands of the private capitalists, so it wasn't the type of socialism that directly focused on the employee-employer relationship, which was the original goal, to overcome that slave-master, king-subject, serf-lord relationship that had pretty much dominated society forever. Now, in these democratic socialist systems in Northern and Western Europe, the government was still in control of some industries, utilities, transportations, and banks, but mostly what they did was focus on heavy regulations and taxation. Their goals included labor protections, income redistribution, basic welfare like education, housing, healthcare, things like that. All the stuff we're still fighting for in the United States, they've had for kind of a long time. Now, while the communists and democratic socialists have plenty of real issues with each other's ideas, what's definitely true is that the capitalists hate them both and kind of treat them the same and use the terms interchangeably and don't really put any effort towards distinguishing them from one another. But socialists have real critiques of both systems. On one hand, communism excessively empowers the state apparatus. On the other hand, democratic socialism leaves a lot of capital and power in the hands of private interests, which doesn't help anybody. Meanwhile, the United States completely solidified their view on the whole thing. To them, like I was saying, they thought it's all the same thing. Communism, socialism, democratic socialism, Marxism, even just the word liberal, it pretty much all means the same shit to them because, again, they don't care. And it's to their benefit that all the worst things of each of those can be the same thing. So no matter what a communist does, a socialist is in trouble for, or what liberals do, or identity politics, or whatever's going on, whatever the flavor of the day for any of those things are, they're all the same and they're all bad. Now, why did the USA cement their opinion so firmly and it's still that way? Well, there's two reasons and they're kind of obvious. The first one is we're dumb. We're not that smart. We have a horrible education system, way worse than the rest of the world, and we just don't teach this stuff. So it's just feelings and whatever someone's grandpa or uncle says. That's just the truth now. The other is the Cold War and the ideology we pushed during that time, from McCarthyism and the Red Scare to just everything being anti-Russia up to today, where anything that happens that Democrats don't like is some kind of Russian conspiracy. In the 1970s and 80s through 2008, neoliberalism emerged. Now, neoliberalism is the idea that private enterprise always yields superior economic results, including in housing and healthcare and education, which is obviously not true. We know that from our terrible education systems and our horrible healthcare system and our terrible, disgusting private prisons and pretty much everything else, that privately run systems don't always yield the best results. Think about coronavirus right now. Has the private system yielded enough supplies for all the hospitals? No. Has the private system had enough storage for bodies? No. So clearly, private enterprise does not always yield the best results. In 1989, the USSR collapsed and the whole world basically declared capitalism the winner. Now, there were a lot of reasons for why the USSR collapsed. One of them was that they started getting TVs and other forms of proof that the USSR, the people there had horrible consumption levels. People in capitalist countries just had more shit and better shit and more entertaining shit and better made shit. And so, like, what was really the benefit of living in a communist country if they didn't have anything to show for it? There was also a ton of resentment over the terrible civil liberty issues that they had there. And those two things pretty much combined to lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And once the Soviet Union fell, all those people in those disparate countries didn't really know what to do. When they were part of the Soviet Union, they had never really learned of any other type of socialism, so the only other system that they knew about was what they hated the most, their arch enemy, according to Richard Wolff, capitalism. And so the world surged towards capitalism. In the early 2000s, China suddenly emerged as a superpower, and they grew faster and more efficiently than any other country ever, pretty much. And that was a socialist system. Well, it was a mix of state capitalism and democratic socialism and dictatorship and all sorts of things. But they were anti-capitalist to some degree, although they're also hyper-capitalist to other degrees. So it's a weird place, but it did show that adherence to capitalism wasn't the only way to quickly and efficiently bring a whole lot of people up from poverty, to educate a whole lot of people, and to become a serious economic threat in the world. And then 2008 came, and the entire economy crashed pretty much everywhere. And it turns out that neoliberalism surge of economic boom was based on debt. In 2007 and 2008, debt bubbles burst and took down the global capitalist systems. And suddenly overnight, banks stopped bashing the government as wasteful, started begging them for bailouts. Because before that, banks and the capitalists within capitalist systems were always trying to tear down the structures that were any way associated with socialism. And in America, anything the government did was socialist. It's not true, but that's how people in America felt. And so all the big capitalists, all the mega corporations, all the mega banks, all the too big to fails spent years, decades lobbying the government to lower taxes, to get rid of safety nets, to do everything they can to weaken our country. But then suddenly they weren't doing that anymore. And suddenly they were begging for bailouts. Neoliberals thought we would take this shit lying down. Wolff lays it out. First, mega capitalists profit off debt bubble they created. 2, those capitalists get bailed out after bubble bursts. And 3, austerity on citizens offsets that bailout. So after that crisis, people were pissed, like super pissed. We had just seen that both parties in the United States pretty much cooperated to bail out all the big banks and mega corporations that had not only not been responsible, but had created all the bubbles and popped them and fucked it all up themselves. Everything was their fault, and they were the ones being rewarded. Meanwhile, we, regular people, had all our shit cut. That's bullshit. Suddenly, as a response, populism started to emerge, both on the right and on the left. Now, on the left, it appears as anti-capitalism, and on the right, it appears as pretty much fascism. Now, I got my start with progressive left-wing politics with Occupy while I was in college. Occupy took hold after capitalism's veneer was pretty much shattered after the crisis. People were yearning for something better than capitalism. They were looking for equality, and they were incensed by suddenly disparate income inequality, which are all the recipes that Wolff laid out early on for what created socialism in the first place, in the introduction. So with Occupy, you really see that this mixture of failure, of people being really upset, of people seeing this income inequality, and is the same income inequality that spurred the original socialist movement to start, and they're incensed by it, and so they want to do something about it. They want a new system. They want to crash the current system. They're going to occupy the places that aren't meant for them, and they're going to use them how they want to. They're going to seize something, and that's what they chose to seize, parks and things like that. It was awesome, and it was a great show of power by the people, and it was a lot of fun too. But we didn't just get experience from that. We actually got some real results. Elizabeth Warren, love her or hate her today, she was a great win for Occupy, and I don't think she comes about without that movement. Those things go hand in hand, and she created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which has done amazing things for people. I've used them. I've gone through them. So that's something that you can't take away from her, no matter how you feel about them now. And then nothing happened. 2015, Bernie Sanders. He's the first politician to flirt with the use of the word socialism. He calls himself a democratic socialist. He's not really. He's a reformer, even though he uses the revolutionary terms. But it's great, and it's a good thing. And the use of the word socialism is so important, because now, instead of just thinking about Russia or Venezuela or Cuba or whatever your flavor of socialism to hate is, instead of that, now you have Bernie Sanders. Now you have a guy who was marching with MLK. You got a guy who's been fighting for the people his entire career. Now, I don't think he's the best politician ever. I don't think he's perfect, but we got that, and that's something we earn, and that's something that wasn't possible before Occupy, definitely, and certainly not in the 90s or anything like that. And with that, we get to the end of the chapter. Now, what this chapter did was pretty much set up socialism in context. Teach us how to think about it in terms of its history, but also think about it in terms of why it's taboo, which is the biggest roadblock to achieving any kind of socialist policy in the United States. How did it get to becoming so taboo? And that's essentially because of the connection of socialism to Stalin's USSR. If they would have just kept saying state capitalism or something like that, we'd be in a much better place today. But they didn't. So always fighting against that, and not denying it or anything like that, accepting it and saying that, yo, that was a version of it that sucked. It wasn't good. There were benefits. There were things they did well. There were things they did really, really bad. But just having to deal with that as a socialist is an interesting thing. And as I dive deeper into this book and into understanding socialism, there are already questions that I'm coming up with. Like what I said in the video is, it seems to me it makes sense that capitalism, socialism, and some form of state capitalism are all things that could exist side by side in one way or another, especially a kind of capitalism where the worker is treated fairly. Maybe the worker doesn't want say, I don't know. Maybe the worker is just like, dude, just tell me what to do. I don't care. We can still treat those people fairly. They can still have equality. They can still have some power. So thank you very much for listening along, following with me in the first chapter of Understanding Socialism by Richard Wolff. I've already read the next chapter. I'm excited to get the next video done. I hope you will join us. But until next time, thank you very much. This has been Run It Back.